A woman named Dora wrote to me 10 days ago, and I have not been able to set her letter down. She said I was 67 years old. I buried my husband of 42 years on a Tuesday. And when I came home from the cemetery, my own daughter had changed the locks, what was waiting for her across the street, and what it did to the people who thought she had nothing left. I need you to hear this. She came home from burying her husband and could not get into her own house. The key she had carried for 31 years did not fit. The lock was new. Her daughter's car was in the driveway. Her daughter did not come to the door. She had sold it, signed the papers that morning before the service, before the dirt was on the grave. Her name was Shelby Pruitt, licensed real estate agent, Pruitt Garland Properties, Denton Falls, Tennessee. A woman who had watched her mother give 42 years to a marriage and a home and had decided that grief was a good time to make a move. She believed her mother was done. She was wrong, because directly across the street, behind a low iron fence and 20 years of uncut ivy, was a house that had been waiting. And inside that house, in a room no one had entered since 2004, was something the whole town of Denton Falls would eventually have to reckon with. The people who were in that lawyer's office watched Shelby Pruitt understand what her mother had found, in public, with nowhere left to go. What happened to Dora Gaines, after 42 years of marriage, after a Tuesday funeral, after a key that no longer fit her own front door, is the reason I read every letter I receive. Stay with me. On the afternoon of September 17, 2019, a Tuesday, Dora Gaines returned home to 114 Sycamore Lane in Denton Falls, Tennessee, after burying her husband of 42 years and found that she could no longer enter her own house. She was 67 years old. She was wearing the black dress she had pressed at 5 in the morning because she had not slept, pressing it in the dark of the kitchen with the iron she had owned for 20 years because the act of pressing required only the hands and not the mind, which was the only kind of work she had been capable of at 5 in the morning on the day she buried Edward. Her hands were still cold from the cemetery, the particular cold that comes from standing too long on ground that was already shaded when the service began, and she had not warmed them in the car because she had driven with the windows cracked, needing the air, needing the sensation of movement to be something other than purely internal. The key she had carried on the same ring since 1988, the ring with the green plastic tag Edward had put on it the year they moved in so she could find it in her bag, which she had replaced twice but always kept green, went into the lock and stopped. It turned a quarter inch and held. She tried it again with more deliberateness. It held. She tried it a third time with the particular, careful patience of someone who does not yet believe what their body already knows, who is extending the period of not knowing because knowing will require something she does not have ready. Then she stood on the porch and understood. The lock had been changed. Not broken, not stuck. Changed. A new lock, same position, same shape, different interior. Her daughter Shelby's white Lexus was parked in the driveway behind Dora's own car, which meant Shelby was inside, which meant Shelby had been inside. Dora knocked. She used the particular knock she had used for 42 years when she came home to a locked door, the 3-beat knock that Edward had always recognized from across the house. She knocked twice. The curtain in the front window moved slightly. She saw it move. She was certain she saw it, the hem of the curtain she had hung in 2003 lifting and settling, and the door did not open. She stood on the porch for a moment in the September heat, which was still substantial at 4 in the afternoon, the Tennessee September that does not believe it is finished with summer. And she looked at the door and at the curtain that had stopped moving, and at the welcome mat Edward had chosen at the hardware store in 2015 because it had a pattern of oak leaves and he had liked that. Then her legs made a decision without consulting her. She sat down on the porch step, not the top step but the second one, the lower one, the one that put her slightly out of sight of the window, and she looked at the street. She looked at the maple tree at the edge of the yard that Edward had planted in 1994 from a whip sapling he had carried from a nursery in his passenger seat, The tree that was now 40 feet tall and provided in September a shadow that reached across the yard to the sidewalk. She looked at the street and the houses across it and the late afternoon light on the pavement, and she sat there for a long time in her funeral dress with her hands in her lap, and she did not make a sound. This was the first thing Dora Gaines would not let Shelby Pruitt take from her. The dignity of not screaming on her own front porch on the day she buried her husband. She had other dignities she would not let go of either, but this was the first. What happened next came from across the street. A woman was standing at the iron fence on the far side of Sycamore Lane, at the edge of a property that had been empty for as long as Dora had lived here. The dark house, the ivy-covered one, the one with the persimmon tree in the backyard that dropped fruit into the lane in the fall, and watching. She was perhaps 80 years old, small and upright, with the particular uprightness of a woman who has made a physical decision about how she will carry herself and has been honoring that decision for 60 years. She had white hair pinned back with 2 clips and the unhurried attention of someone who has lived long enough to understand that some moments require a witness, that the presence of a witness is itself a form of help, and who is therefore standing at the fence and watching and not pretending not to. She said clearly, pitching her voice to carry across Sycamore Lane without shouting, "You come over here when you're ready, honey. I've got iced tea, and I've been waiting for a reason to use it." Her name was June Aldrich. She had lived at the little house on the corner of Sycamore and Birch for 53 years, in the yellow house with the deep porch and the rose garden along the south side that had won the Denton Falls Garden Club prize 4 times, and which she maintained with the specific devotion of someone for whom a garden is not a hobby but a continuing argument for the value of patience. She had a memory for detail that was precise and unself-conscious in the way of people who simply notice things as a matter of course and have always noticed them. Who was in whose driveway? When the notary's car arrived? What time the locksmith's van had come? She was the first person who had been kind to Dora since the funeral director that morning, and Dora looked at her across the street for a moment, and then crossed Sycamore Lane in her black dress and her low heels, and sat down at June's kitchen table and wrapped her hands around a glass of iced tea and let herself breathe for the first time since 6 o'clock that morning. June said nothing for several minutes. She sat across the table with her own glass, and she did not offer condolences or platitudes or any of the things that people offer in these moments that require the recipient to receive them and respond and perform gratitude for the kindness while simultaneously being unable to feel anything at all. She simply sat, which was the correct thing, and after several minutes she said, "The papers went through this morning. I saw the notary's car at 7:30 before the service." Dora looked at her. She said, "She sold it?" "Conditional sale," June said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone who has been thinking about how to say this for several hours. "My understanding is there's a 60-day closing period, but the transaction was initiated this morning. She didn't tell you. It was not a question." "She did not tell me," Dora said. The sound she made then was not crying. It was quieter than crying and more final, the sound of a person recalibrating in real time what they believe was possible in the world. The specific recalibration of discovering that a boundary you did not know you needed because you trusted it implicitly does not exist. She set the glass down on the table. She looked at her hands. They were perfectly still, which she noticed because she had expected them to shake. June watched her. "Dora," she said after another moment, "I need to show you something, but not today. Today, you just sit here as long as you need. There's no hurry on anything except sitting here." Dora sat there while the light in June's kitchen moved from the bright angle of late afternoon to the softer gold of early evening, and then to the blue-gray of dusk. She did not go back across the street. When it was nearly dark, when the maple tree in her yard had lost its shadow to the failing light, a car pulled up in front of June's house and Shelby Pruitt got out. Shelby was 41 years old, tallish, with her father's strong cheekbones and something in the set of her jaw that was entirely her own. and had always given Dora the sense that her daughter had arrived in the world with a destination already in mind. She was wearing the blazer she wore in her professional headshots for Pruitt Garland Properties, the dark one with the structured shoulders, and this was not the blazer you wore to your father's funeral or to a conversation with your grieving mother. This was the blazer you wore when you were going to need to project authority. She crossed the lawn and stood at the edge of June's property. Not at the gate, but at the property line, and she said, "Mom, you need to come inside. There are things we need to discuss, and you're making this harder than it needs to be." Dora looked at her daughter across the small distance of June's front yard. She said, "I knocked. You didn't answer." "I was on a call," Shelby said, which was the sentence that would sit in Dora's mind for weeks afterward, the one she returned to. I was on a call on the day her father was buried when her mother knocked at the door of her own home in her funeral dress with cold hands. The timing of all of this is difficult for everyone. She paused and her voice shifted into the register it used when it was explaining something to Dora that it believed Dora was processing too slowly. It was a register Dora recognized. "The house is underwater, Mom. You and Dad took out a second mortgage in 2017 that neither of you told me about, and the payments aren't sustainable on what's in the estate. I found a buyer who can close fast and save you from a worse situation down the road. You can stay through the end of October. I arranged that specifically. That's 35 days, which is more than enough time to find something suitable." June had gone very still in the doorway behind Dora. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a woman who has made a decision about what she is about to say. "She signed nothing," June said, quietly, precisely. Shelby looked at June as though she had not previously registered that June existed as a person with standing in this situation. "This is a family matter," Shelby said. "She doesn't have to sign anything," June said. "The house was in both names, joint tenancy. Your father is not 48 hours in the ground, and a joint tenancy property does not transfer on the death of one owner without probate. Your mother is the surviving tenant. Whatever your buyer signed this morning, it is not a done transaction." The silence that followed this lasted several seconds and had a particular texture, the texture of a sentence landing in a room where it was not expected to land. Shelby looked at her mother. Her jaw was doing the thing it did. "You should come inside," she said. "We'll talk in the morning when everyone has had some rest and is thinking more clearly." "I am thinking clearly right now," Dora said. "Come back when you have a lawyer present and something accurate to tell me. Go home, Shelby." Shelby stood at the property line for a moment longer, and then she turned and walked back to the Lexus and got in and drove down Sycamore Lane. Dora watched the car go. Then she turned back to June's kitchen and sat back down at the table, and June poured more tea, and they sat in the kitchen while the dark finished coming and the crickets in the garden started up. Then June said, carefully in the tone of someone placing something fragile and important on a surface and not wanting it to tip, "There's something I have been keeping for 20 years that I believe belongs to you now. But you need to hear it when you're ready for it, not before. Are you ready?" Dora looked at her. She was 67 years old, and she had buried her husband that morning, and her daughter had sold her house while she stood at the graveside, and she was sitting in a neighbor's kitchen in her funeral dress with iced tea she couldn't taste, and she had, in the past 6 hours, run out of the capacity to be surprised. She said, "Tell me." June Aldrich had lived on Sycamore Lane for 53 years, which meant she had been watching the house at number 113. The dark one, the ivy-covered one, set back from the street behind the low iron fence, since before it was empty. She had been watching it for 20 years of its emptiness, and for 11 years before that, when the Greers had lived in it. She had known Howard Greer since 1966, 3 years after he and Marion had built the house and moved in, and she had known Marion since the same year. And the four of them, June and her late husband Carl, Howard, and Marion, had been the kind of neighbors who ate dinner together on Friday evenings in the summer and looked after each other's mail and did not need to make formal plans to be in each other's lives, because they were simply in each other's lives, the way that neighbors used to be in the particular American neighborhoods of a particular era and are rarely still. Marion had died in the fall of 1998 of a cancer that had been diagnosed in April and had moved quickly, which Howard had described afterward as both the cruelty and the mercy of it. Cruel because there had been so little time, merciful because there had been so little time. Howard had stayed on for a year and then had not been able to remain. The house was too full of her, he had said, meaning it as a statement of love and also of inability. The specific inability of a man who had built a house with a woman and could not live in the negative space of where she had been. He had moved to his daughter's place in Knoxville in the fall of 1999. Before he left, he had given June a manila envelope, the standard letter-sized kind, sealed with a strip of tape. And he had said, "Keep this until the right person comes to this street and needs what's inside." June had said, "How will I know the right person?" Howard had said, "You'll know, you always know." She had kept the envelope in the drawer of her writing desk for 20 years, through the death of her husband Carl, through the various turnovers of the other houses on Sycamore Lane, through the families that came and went and the ones that stayed, watching and waiting with the patience that came from having made a promise to a man she respected and from believing that the man's judgment extended across 2 decades and into a future he would not live to see, was still worth honoring. She had watched Dora Gaines for 31 years. She had watched her raise Shelby alone for much of it, while Edward traveled for work. She had watched her keep the house and tend the garden and bring soup to June when June had her knee replaced in 2011, and sit with Carl in the last year when he was not well enough to be alone but too proud to say so. She had made her decision about Dora years ago. She had been waiting not for certainty, but for the moment. And September 17, 2019 had arrived with an unmistakable finality. She gave Dora the envelope that night. The letter inside was 2 pages, written in the careful block letters of a man who had been a civil engineer for 30 years and believed that his handwriting, like his calculations, should be legible to anyone who needed to read it. It began, "If you are reading this, June found you. June's judgment has never failed me in 40 years, so I trust you before I know you. My name was Howard Greer. I built the house across the street in 1961, my wife Marion and I together, which is the only way a house should be built. Marion died in 1998, and I could not stay in the house after because she was in every room of it, and I was not strong enough to be with her that way. But I could not sell it either. What Dora read in those 2 pages she would carry with her into every room of what followed, not as a set of instructions but as a form of company, the voice of a man she had never met who had thought carefully about what he was leaving and had thought carefully about who he was leaving it for and who had trusted a neighbor's watching eye to make the match. She understood 4 things when she finished reading. Howard Greer had loved the house with the specific love of someone who had built it with their hands and lost the person they built it for, which is a love with no clean resolution, only accommodation. He had not wanted it sold or developed or occupied by strangers who did not know what they were living in. He had wanted someone who knew what it meant to stay in a place after it has taken the most important thing you had. And he had left something inside. He was deliberate about not naming it in the letter, saying only there is something in the East Room that I believe will matter to the right person, and I will explain it from inside, not from this page, because some things need to be found before they can be explained. The key was brass and old and heavier than modern keys with a circular bow and the specific cut-tooth pattern of a lock from the early 1960s. The pattern of a lock that had been installed once and never replaced because no one had needed to replace it. June drove Dora across the street the following morning, September 18th, a Wednesday, because Dora had not slept, and June did not want her to go alone to a house she had never been in on, the morning after the worst day of her life. The front walk was flagstone, each stone heaved slightly by decades of tree roots pressing from below. The gaps between them filled with moss that was dense and soft and held the moisture of the previous night's dew. The porch boards held without complaint. The front door was painted dark green, original color from the early 1960s. The paint blistered and lifting at the corners of the panels, but still present. Still dark green, still itself. The lock accepted the key without resistance, which struck Dora as significant. That a lock unused for 20 years would open on the first turn, though she would understand later that Howard had oiled it on his last visit in 1999 because he was a man who thought about things like this. The smell inside was the smell of a house that has been loved and then closed, which is different from the smell of a house that has simply been abandoned. It was cedar and old fabric and the dry sweetness of paper and wood that have been at rest in still air for a long time, and underneath it, very faint. Something she couldn't name that might have been Marion's particular cleaning method, or the wood of the kitchen cabinets, or the specific mineral composition of the water from the well, which she would learn later the house still used. The furniture was sheeted in white cotton covers that had yellowed to cream. The floors were hardwood, dusty but unwarped, the boards still tight, not one of them lifting or separating at the joint. Every window had its curtains drawn, the interior dim and even, the light that came through the curtains making the rooms feel not dark but protected, held. Dora walked through the front room and the hallway and the kitchen. The kitchen had dishes in the cabinet stacked in the order that a man who had done the dishes the same way for 30 years would stack them. A cast iron skillet hung on a hook over the stove that had been seasoned to the blue-black of long use, and which she instinctively wanted to take down and clean and heat and return to work. She went upstairs. She found the east room at the end of the hall. It was smaller than the other rooms, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, north-facing on one side and east-facing on the other, with a single east window that looked out over the backyard where a persimmon tree had gone entirely wild in 20 years of no one's attention and was dropping its small orange fruit onto the grass in the September morning, the grass long and unmown and carrying the fruit without bruising it because it was deep enough to cushion. In the east room there was a wooden work table, oak, solid, the kind of table built to last rather than to look like it lasts, and a straight-back chair and a filing cabinet in gray metal locked. On the center of the table, placed with the deliberateness of something positioned and not just set down, was a wooden box, latched but not locked, about the size of a large briefcase, the wood dark with age and handling. She did not open it immediately. She stood in the east room with the September light coming through the east window and the sound of the persimmon tree just audible in the breeze, and she held her hands at her sides and she looked at the box and she thought about Edward, who had died 48 hours ago, and about Howard, who had died she did not yet know when, and about Marion, whose name she did not yet know, and she was quiet for a moment that was longer than a moment. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Shelby. She turned it face down on the work table beside the box and went downstairs and sat on the front porch and called June, who was standing at her own front door across the street watching. "I need a lawyer," Dora said. "Someone who does property and estates, not someone Shelby has ever used or knows." "I have exactly one name," June said. "Raymond Osei. He's on Birch Street. He's been in this county for 20 years, and he is the opposite of what Shelby Pruitt expects." What Dora did not know yet, what she would not fully understand for another 4 days, was that while she was sitting on the porch of Howard Greer's house with her phone in her lap, Shelby Pruitt was at that exact moment driving toward Sycamore Lane with the man who was her business partner, and Dora would come to understand, the architect of the morning's events. His name was Kyle Dermott, senior partner of Pruitt Garland Properties. 55 years old, heavy-set and easy in his body in the way of men who have spent decades walking into rooms and reading them and leaving having taken what they came for. He had a particular way of looking at properties that was not aesthetic but extractive, seeing lots and setbacks and road frontage and zoning classifications the way other people see rooms and windows and gardens. He pulled up to the iron fence at 113 Sycamore Lane in a silver pickup truck at 10:30, and got out and looked at the house and then looked at Dora on the porch and said, from the gate, without introducing himself, "That's a prime lot, corner position, quarter-acre minimum, Good road frontage on two sides. Who's the owner of record? Dora looked at him across the iron fence and the 20 feet of unmown grass between them. I don't believe that's your concern, she said. Shelby had gotten out of the passenger seat. She was standing at the gate with her arms crossed in the blazer, and she said, Mom, who gave you access to this property? You shouldn't be in there. You have no idea what the legal status is, and you could be trespassing and creating a liability. I have a key, Dora said, given to me by the neighbor at number 111 on behalf of the owner of record, who gave it to her in 1999 for exactly this purpose. Kyle Dermott looked at the house again. His expression had changed slightly, in the way of a man who has just received a piece of information he was not expecting and is updating his assessment. You should reach out to whoever manages the estate, he said, and let them know there's serious interest in the lot. I can make a straightforward offer and close in 30 days. Clean and simple. I'll keep that in mind, Dora said. She went inside and closed the front door. She sat in Howard's front room on the arm of the covered sofa, because sitting fully seemed like too much commitment, and she looked at the closed door and listened to the sound of Shelby and Kyle Dermott talking on the other side of the iron fence. Too low for her to hear the specific words, but not too low for her to hear the tone, which was the tone of people planning. She had not opened the wooden box. She did not yet know what was in the filing cabinet. But she understood with the particular cold clarity that grief sometimes produces in the mind when it is finished with the immediate emergency and has moved into its working phase, that whatever was in this house was significant, and that Kyle Dermott had looked at it for 30 seconds and wanted it, and that she was going to need to understand it before she let anyone else near it. The lawyer's name was Raymond Ossie. He was 48 years old, and he ran his practice out of a converted Victorian house on Birch Street in Denton Falls, 3 blocks from the courthouse, in a building that smelled permanently of coffee and old paper, and had accumulated over 20 years of Raymond's occupation, the specific atmosphere of a place that takes its work seriously. The waiting room had a framed needlepoint on the wall that read, in careful cross-stitch done in dark green thread on cream linen, the law is a blunt instrument. Bring patience. Raymond had not made the needlepoint. It had been there when he took the space, and he had decided on his first day that it was correct and should stay. He was an estates and property attorney who had, as June described him, she had known his mother, who had gone to the same church as Carl, the particular combination of being meticulous and being genuinely angry on behalf of the people he represented, which she said was rarer than it should be, and was the thing that made the difference in contested matters. Dora called him Thursday morning, September 19th, 2 days after she had buried Edward, and he saw her that same afternoon at 4 o'clock, which told her something. She brought the letter from Howard Greer and the brass key on its ring and the 4 voicemails from Shelby, each one slightly more pressured in tone than the last, and she sat in the chair across his desk and told him everything in the order it had happened, from the key that didn't fit in the lock on Tuesday afternoon to the man at the iron fence on Wednesday morning. Raymond listened without taking notes and without interrupting, which she found she needed, the experience of being listened to without having to manage the listener. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The property at 113 Sycamore Lane. Do you know how it's held legally? A trust, Dora said. June mentioned it. Howard mentioned it in his letter, that the taxes were paid through a trust that would carry for 30 years. I'll run the title this afternoon, Raymond said. I'll know what we're working with by tomorrow morning. He paused. Don't open the filing cabinet without me present. Don't let anyone on the property, not Shelby, not Dermott, not anyone they send. And don't engage with any communications from Pruitt Garland directly. Send them to me. He made a note. And on the matter of your house, the sale of 114 Sycamore Lane, send me everything you have. The deed, any mortgage documents you can find, and anything related to the second mortgage from 2017 if you have access to it. He paused. Your husband's name was on the deed. Edward Gaines, Dora said. He died Tuesday morning. Raymond looked at his notepad, and the closing was filed at 8:47 in the morning. Dora said. The service was at 10. Raymond wrote something down. He wrote it slowly, which she understood was not because he was slow, but because he was choosing what to say next carefully. I want you to understand, he said, that the timeline you've just described is potentially very significant. A property transfer executed in the hours immediately following a co-owner's death, without probate, without the surviving owner's signature or knowledge, raises questions that an estate court will want to answer. He stopped. I don't want to say more than that until I've done the research, but I want you to know that you came to me at the right time and that the situation is not as settled as your daughter has presented it. She drove back to Sycamore Lane. She let herself into Howard's house with the brass key and went upstairs to the east room and sat in the straight-back chair at the work table and looked at the wooden box and the locked filing cabinet. She had been avoiding the box since the morning before, the way you avoid a thing that you know will cost you something to know, and you're not yet certain you have enough left to pay. She opened it. Inside, organized in labeled folders in the manner of a man who had assembled something over years and had filed it as he went, were Howard Greer's records. Not primarily financial records. There were some of those tax documents and insurance certificates and the property maintenance records she would come to understand in detail later. What Howard had spent the last years of his life assembling was documentation of a different kind. Letters, many of them. Photographs, dozens. Exhibition notices and gallery announcements and newspaper clippings from Tennessee arts publications from the 1970s and 1980s. Hand-drawn inventory diagrams with measurements and condition notes, correspondence with collectors. All of it organized, all of it labeled, all of it centered on a single subject. A collection of handmade ceramic works that a woman named Marion Greer had produced over the course of 30 years and sold partially through a gallery in Nashville that had closed in 1984. Dora lifted the first folder. The clippings were from Tennessee arts publications, several of them regional newsletters that no longer existed. Two from a Nashville alternative weekly that had covered the visual arts with more seriousness than most. Marion Greer's name appeared in them repeatedly, and the language used around it, a distinctive personal vocabulary, an approach to surface and form that resists easy categorization, work of unusual depth for a self-taught practitioner, was the language of people who were paying serious attention and knew it. She lifted another folder and found the photographs. They were a combination of professional and amateur images, the professional ones clearly from gallery documentation, and the amateur ones clearly Howard's own, taken in natural light with the care that suggested he understood how to look at what he was photographing. The ceramics in the photographs were unlike anything she had seen in a store or a gallery or a friend's home. They were not the ceramics of a hobby or a skilled amateur. They had the quality. She did not have the technical vocabulary for what she was seeing, but she had the eyes, because 26 years in a school library had given her a deep familiarity with the difference between things that were merely accomplished and things that were genuinely necessary, of objects that had been made by someone who understood something specific and had no other way to show it. At the back of the box, in a separate folder labeled in Howard's block print East Cabinet, Raymond, was a folded note. It said, "For the right person. Everything in this room belongs together. Don't let them separate it. Howard." She put the folder back. She closed the box. She looked at the locked filing cabinet and thought about what was inside it and what it would cost her to know. Then she did what she had always done when the weight of a thing exceeded her immediate capacity. She put her back against the wall beneath the east window and she sat on the floor. Not in the chair, because the chair was the right height for working, and she was not working. She sat on the floor of the east room of Howard Greer's house and looked at the wooden box on the table and the labeled folders visible through the open lid, and she was quiet for a long time. She was 67 years old. She had buried her husband 2 days ago. Her daughter had sold her home while she stood at the grave. She was sitting on the floor of a dead man's house holding photographs of a dead woman's art, and she was trying to understand whether she was the right person or whether she had simply arrived here out of grief, through a neighbor's kindness and a brass key, and was occupying a space that was meant for someone else. She said it out loud. The room was empty and had been empty for 20 years and had no opinion about being spoken to. She said, "I am afraid I am not who he thought I was." Howard Greer left this for someone with the character to protect it. That is what his letter said. That is what June said about why she waited 31 years before she gave the envelope to anyone. And I am a woman who worked in a school library for 26 years and who raised a daughter who changed the locks on the day of her father's funeral. And I do not think those are the credentials Howard Greer had in mind when he wrote that letter on his lined paper in his careful block letters and put it in a manila envelope and handed it to a neighbor he trusted. I am afraid that Raymond will call tomorrow with the title results and tell me the trust has a problem or the property is contested or there's a legal reason that none of this is mine to protect. And I will have to leave this house and leave these photographs and leave whatever is in that locked cabinet for Kyle Dermott to take and sell. And Marion Greer's work will end up in a storage unit or broken up and dispersed and sold separately to people who do not know what they are holding, which is what happens to things when they are taken out of the context of the love that built them. I am afraid I came to the right place too late. I am afraid that grief has made me believe I deserve something I have not earned, and that the wanting of it is making me confuse what is real with what I need to be real. She sat with that for a long time. The persimmon tree moved in the yard below and a branch tapped against the glass, once lightly, the way you knock when you are not sure you should be knocking. She looked up at it. She thought about Edward. She thought about the specific thing Edward used to say when she was overwhelmed by a situation that had too many moving parts and no clear path through it. That the way through a thing you can't see past is not to look for the end, but to identify the smallest possible next step and take it. Just that one step, and then identify the one after that. She had told him it sounded like advice from a self-help book, and he had said, "Yes, that's where I found it." And they had both laughed. And she had taken it seriously anyway because he had taken it seriously, and he was usually right about the things he took seriously. She thought about June, who had carried a manila envelope in her writing desk for 20 years because she believed the right person would eventually come to Sycamore Lane. June had been watching for 31 years. June had decided. She put the photographs back in their folder. She closed the wooden box. She smoothed her dress and she stood up and she called Raymond. "The filing cabinet," she said. "When can you come?" "Tomorrow morning," Raymond said. 9 o'clock sharp. And Dora, I have the title results. I want to tell you in person. She slept in June's spare room that night. June had not asked her to and had not offered in the way that makes an offer a burden. Had simply said, "I made up the spare room when I came home this afternoon, and the towels are in the cabinet, and there's no reason to go back to a house with a new lock before you have a lawyer." Dora lay in the spare room under a quilt that smelled of cedar and looked at the ceiling and thought about Marion Greer, who had produced 30 years of work that the world had nearly lost, and about what the word collection means when it is applied to 30 years of a person's best self, the work they made not for money or for recognition, but because the making was the only way to say the thing that needed to be said. The next morning, Raymond arrived at 9 exactly, which she noted was not 8:58 or 9:03, but 9, which told her more about him. He had a briefcase and a pair of white cotton gloves and an expression that was carefully composed, but not composed enough to entirely conceal the thing underneath it, which was the expression of a man who had read something the night before that had made it difficult to sleep. He used a key obtained from the county records office. He had filed for access to the trust documents as part of the title search to open the filing cabinet. He spent 40 minutes examining the contents. He did not speak while he worked. He moved through the folders with the deliberate, unhurried precision that she was coming to understand was his natural speed. And when he finished, he closed the cabinet and stood up and looked at her with the expression of a careful person who is working to remain careful in the presence of something that makes carefulness difficult. "Marion Greer," he said, "produced approximately 240 ceramic works over her 30-year productive period. Howard documented all of them, not just the ones that sold, all of them. Provenance, photographs, exhibition history, sale records where they existed, correspondence with collectors and gallery owners, condition notes, measurements, everything. He paused. There are 61 works still in this house, in the locked room at the end of the downstairs hall, the one with the padlock. Dora had not gone through that door. She had tried the handle and found it locked and had noted it and moved on. "What are they worth?" she said. "I called a colleague this morning," Raymond said. "Before I came here, she is an associate professor of American craft and material culture at Vanderbilt. Her name is Vera Hutchins. I described 3 of the documented pieces to her from Howard's records and read her the exhibition notes and the correspondence with the collector who had bought the Nashville work." He paused. She said Marion Greer's name is known in academic circles as the name of a self-taught Tennessee ceramicist who showed briefly in Nashville in the early 1980s and then disappeared from the record entirely when the gallery closed, and that a complete surviving body of work from her productive period, documented in original condition, in a coherent collection, would be, and she said this word specifically, extraordinary. He looked at Dora. "I want Vera to come in person before I give you a number." "But Dora, this is not the hobby work of a woman who made things to keep herself busy. This is something that people in the relevant field have been looking for, and it has been in this house for 40 years. And then his phone rang. He looked at the screen and then looked at Dora. "It's Kyle Dermott," he said. Raymond Osei did not answer Kyle Dermott's call on Friday morning. He held the phone and watched it ring and then set it face down on the work table of Howard Greer's East Room and looked at Dora, who looked back at him, and they waited. The call ended. Raymond picked the phone up and listened to the voicemail that came through 30 seconds later, and then he played it on speaker so that Dora could hear. Kyle Dermott's voice on the voicemail was the voice he used when he believed the situation was already resolved in his favor, and the remaining steps were administrative. Friendly, unhurried, carrying the particular warmth of a man who has not yet understood that he has already lost. He said that he was calling on behalf of Pruitt Garland Properties regarding the property at 113 Sycamore Lane, that he had done some preliminary research and understood the trust holding the property was coming up on its terminal date, and that he had a motivated and serious buyer prepared to move quickly on both the lot and the adjacent property at 114, and that he felt confident they could structure a transaction that was clean and beneficial for everyone involved. He left his number twice, slowly, the way you leave a number for someone you expect to call you back before the day is out. Raymond set the phone down. "The trust terminal date," he said, "is November 2029. It was established in 1999 for a 30-year term. Dermott either has incorrect information or he's testing whether you know the actual date." He looked at Dora steadily. "He's betting that you don't." Dora was quiet for a moment. She said, "What does Shelby know about this house? About what's in it?" "I don't know yet," Raymond said. "My suspicion is that she doesn't know the details, but that Dermott has done enough preliminary title research to know the trust exists and to want access before the details are clear. He's moving fast because fast is the strategy when you're working with incomplete information. You try to close before the other party finds out what they actually have." He paused. "I intend to find out exactly what Shelby knew and when she knew it. That question has relevance to the matter of your house that goes beyond the obvious." He called Vera Hutchins that afternoon. Vera Hutchins drove down from Nashville on Saturday morning in a small gray hatchback with 2 cardboard boxes of reference materials and a portable photography setup that she assembled in the downstairs locked room with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times in many different spaces. She was 53 years old, precise and purposeful in her movements, with the focused quality of attention that belongs to specialists who have spent decades developing an expertise that very few people share and that matters to them more than the sharing. She spent 3 hours in the locked room with Marion Greer's ceramics. She moved through the room slowly, from piece to piece, using a loop and a flashlight on a flexible arm, and making notes in a small spiral notebook with a pencil. Never pen, she explained once to Dora, who was watching from the doorway, because ink is a commitment and at this stage everything is still a question. She photographed each piece from multiple angles with systematic care, building the kind of visual record that would travel with the collection wherever it went and would speak for it to anyone who had not been in this room. She spoke very little while she was working. Dora stood in the doorway or sat in the straight-back chair from the east room that she had carried down and watched and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not interruption. When Vera finished, she covered the work again with the cloths it had been stored under, carefully each fold deliberate, and came to the kitchen table and sat down and accepted a cup of tea from June, who had come over that morning and who had made tea on the camp stove Howard had kept in the kitchen cabinet, and who had been sitting quietly in the corner doing what June did in situations like this, which was witness. Vera looked at Dora and Raymond across the table and she said, Marion Greer was not a regional ceramicist in the sense that that phrase is usually meant. She was not someone working in a local tradition for a local market with local ambitions. What she was doing was developing a formal and technical vocabulary that was entirely her own, and that sits entirely outside the mainstream of American studio pottery in her period, both in technique and in intention. The Nashville shows were brief and the gallery was small, and the critical infrastructure for taking serious notice of work like this in Tennessee in the early 1980s simply did not exist. And then Howard, I believe deliberately, moved her out of the public record. He stopped showing the work after the gallery closed. He stopped lending it to institutions. He declined inquiries. He kept everything, every piece, every document, every exchange with every collector. And he built a provenance record that is, frankly, better than the provenance record for most work that has been handled by professional dealers. She paused. He protected her. Whether that was entirely the right decision from the perspective of her legacy, I can't say. But he kept it whole and he kept it documented, and that changes everything about what happens now. She opened the folder she had brought from her car, a green manila folder with her notes from the previous night's calls. I spoke with a colleague at the American Craft Museum in New York. I described the collection to her without identifying the maker. Her response before I told her the name was that a complete documented body of work, of the quality I was describing, from a self-taught American ceramicist working outside the mainstream in the 1960s through the 1980s, would be a significant acquisition for any major institution. When I told her the name, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "That's not possible. Marion Greer's work was lost." I said, "Apparently not." Vera looked at Dora directly. 61 works, complete documentation. A coherent body from a maker whose reputation has grown in her absence for 40 years. My conservative estimate for the collection as a whole is $1.8 million. My professional opinion, based on the institutional interest I've already had in conversation about in the past 24 hours, is that a major institution will bid considerably higher than that. The number settled in Howard Greer's kitchen the way numbers of that magnitude settle. Not dramatically, but with a certain completeness. The way the last piece of a thing falling into place is quieter than the earlier pieces, because it simply belongs there. Raymond said nothing. June put down her cup. Dora looked at her hands flat on the table and thought about the folder labeled East Cabinet. Raymond. For the right person. Everything in this room belongs together. Don't let them separate it. She thought about Howard driving away from this house in the fall of 1999, with nothing but a forwarding address in Knoxville and the knowledge that he had left something whole and had trusted a neighbor's judgment to find the person who would keep it that way, and who had died. She had looked him up. Raymond had found the date. In 2014, which meant he had waited 15 years in Knoxville and had not lived to see the envelope opened. She said, "I wanted to go to a museum, not sold privately, not broken up, not split between buyers. Marion's name on it, Howard's name on it, together." the whole collection in the condition he kept it, as a unified thing. Vera looked at her with an expression that was not surprise but was close to relief. The relief of someone who has been hoping to hear a particular sentence and has now heard it. "I hoped you would say that," she said. "It's the right decision and I will help you make it happen." The hearing was scheduled for October 14, 2019, a Monday, in the conference suite at Carmichael and Reed on Main Street in Denton Falls, which was a firm that handled commercial real estate and estate mediation, and which Raymond had chosen because its conference room had a window that faced the street, and good light and enough space for everyone who needed to be there. The hearing was formally a probate mediation on the contested elements of Edward Gaines's estate, and specifically on the validity of the sale of 114 Sycamore Lane. Raymond had filed on 3 grounds. The first was procedural. The transaction had been initiated without the surviving owner's knowledge or consent, and had been executed before probate had been opened, which was irregular at minimum and potentially voidable. The second was substantive. The timeline placed the initiation of the sale in the hours immediately following Edward's death, before any legal transfer of ownership had occurred, and the closing documents bore a timestamp that preceded the funeral by several hours. The third was the most significant. The listing agreement that authorized the sale bore Edward Gaines's signature on a document dated July 15, 2019, and Edward Gaines had been admitted to Denton Falls Memorial Hospital on July 8, 2019, and had been prescribed a combination of medications that his attending physician, who had agreed to provide a statement, was prepared to testify had materially impaired his capacity to understand and execute financial agreements at the time the document was signed. Kyle Dermott was at the table in his good suit, the one he wore to closings, dark with a subtle pattern, the suit of a man who understands that presentation is its own argument. Shelby Pruitt was beside him in the blazer, in the chair to his left, with a leather portfolio on the table in front of her that she did not open during the proceeding. There were 6 people in the room: Raymond and Dora, Dermott and his attorney, Shelby, and Vera Hutchins, who had agreed to serve as a material witness on the matter of the adjacent property's value and the context of the estate. Raymond presented the timeline. He presented the death certificate, the timestamp on the closing documents, the locksmith's invoice, which showed a service call to 114 Sycamore Lane at 9:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before the church service, 40 minutes after the closing paperwork was filed. He presented the physician's statement. He presented the 3 documents bearing Edward's signature from the summer of 2018 before the hospitalization, which showed clearly in their formation and pressure and consistency what Edward's signature looked like when Edward was well, and he placed beside them the listing agreement from July 2019, and the comparison was not subtle. Dermott's attorney raised objections. The mediator overruled 2 of them and took the third under consideration and came back 5 minutes later and overruled it as well. Dora sat at her end of the table and watched. She had not looked directly at Shelby since the evening at June's kitchen table, 3 weeks ago, when Shelby had stood at the property line and told her she was making this harder than it needed to be. She looked at her now. Shelby was looking at the documents on the table in front of Raymond with the specific quality of attention of a person who has been watching the ground they were standing on erode for the past several weeks and has now accepted that it is gone. Her jaw was set in the way that Dora knew meant she was not going to speak, because speaking would cost her control, and she had decided control was the last thing left to hold. Kyle Dermott leaned back in his chair. He looked at Dora with the same appraising quality he had brought to the Iron Gate on that Wednesday morning, the look of a man sizing up what he was working with, deciding what approach would be most efficient, and he said, "I think everyone in this room understands that what Shelby did came from a real concern about her mother's financial situation. The house was genuinely underwater. Dora, you're a 67-year-old woman alone. You've just lost your husband. The debt on that property is not something that resolves itself. What I'm offering is a way out of a complicated situation that gives you something real to work with. Close the sale, clear the debt, and you walk away with liquidity and options. I've been in this business for 30 years. I know what these situations look like, and I know what the realistic outcomes are. You don't want to spend the next 2 years in legal proceedings over a house that has a negative equity position. Let us close this cleanly and you focus on what comes next. The room was quiet. Vera Hutchins, 2 seats to Dora's right, set down her pen with the deliberateness of someone who is choosing not to say something. Raymond looked at his notepad. Shelby looked at the table. Dora looked at Kyle Dermott. She was 67 years old. She had come home from her husband's funeral in her black dress with cold hands, and she had found a new lock on her door. She had been told she was making a scene. She had been told to think more clearly in the morning. She had gone across the street to an empty house on the word of a neighbor she trusted, and she had found a box with a letter inside it, and she had sat on the floor of a dead man's east room and been afraid, genuinely afraid. The named specific fear of a woman who has been told her whole adult life what her situation looks like from the outside, who knows the shape of being dismissed, and she had stood up anyway. She had stood up because June had watched her for 31 years and had decided. Because Howard had thought clearly about what he was building and who he was building it for. Because Edward, who had died 42 years into a marriage that had been the organizing fact of her life, had spent those 42 years telling her, in the way that people who love you tell you things, not in speeches, but in the accumulation of small, consistent observations, that she was someone who could be trusted with the significant things. She said, "I have exactly what I need." 6 words. Not loud. Not delivered with heat, but with the specific quiet of someone stating a fact that has been established and does not require the room's agreement to be true. Dermott opened his mouth. Raymond said, without looking up from his notepad, "My client is finished speaking with yours." The sale of 114 Sycamore Lane was ruled invalid pending full probate review. The listing agreement was suspended, its execution under questionable capacity referred to the Tennessee Real Estate Commission's review process. Edward Gaines's estate entered standard probate, which meant Dora was the primary heir in both properties, 114 Sycamore Lane, and, through the trust instrument that Raymond had confirmed and filed with the court, 113 were under legal protection during the process. Kyle Dermott left without speaking again. At the door, Shelby paused. She turned and looked at her mother across the room. Dora looked back at her. Shelby's face had the expression of someone who has arrived at a place she did not intend to arrive at and does not yet know how to leave it. Whatever she had intended to say, she did not say it. She followed Dermott out and the door closed. The room was quiet. Dora sat for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called June, who had been at home on Sycamore Lane all morning with her rose garden and her iced tea and the patient certainty of someone who has known all along how this ends. "It's done," Dora said. "Come over," June said. "I have ginger snaps." The Marion Greer collection was acquired by the American Craft Museum in New York in February 2020, 5 months after the hearing, for $2.3 million. The negotiation had been conducted by Raymond and Vera Hutchins together over the course of 3 months, and Dora had been present at every meeting and had asked questions and had said no twice to proposals that did not meet her conditions, which had surprised the museum's acquisition team and had not surprised Raymond or Vera. The acquisition agreement specified that the collection would be held intact, not divided, not partially stored, not lent out piecemeal, and exhibited as a unified body of work. It specified the name the Marion and Howard Greer Collection, Denton Falls, Tennessee. It specified that a portion of the proceeds would support an ongoing program of documentation of self-taught Southern craft work, which Vera Hutchins would oversee through Vanderbilt. Dora attended the opening in February. She stood in front of the large sculptural bowl that Howard had placed at the center of his documentation. Honey amber in color, its surface carrying a pattern that the exhibition notes described as derived from the grain structure of Tennessee cedar, but which looked standing in front of it in the museum light, like something more essential than that, like the visual representation of the word patience. And she thought about Howard packing a key into a manila envelope in 1999 and handing it to June Aldrich and driving away. She thought about Marion, whom she had never met but who had spent 30 years making things that a man had spent the rest of his life protecting. She thought about June watching Sycamore Lane for 31 years. She thought about Edward, who had taught her that the smallest next step was always enough. She thought about the word whole and what it means to keep something whole when the easier thing, always, is to let it come apart. She was at peace with some of it. She was still working through the rest. That, as anyone who has buried someone and gone on living knows, is exactly how it goes. 4 months after the acquisition closed in June 2020, Dora established a fund through Raymond's office called the Sycamore Lane Emergency Housing Fund, capitalized at $200,000, specifically for women over 60 in Denton Falls County and the surrounding region who had been displaced from their homes through contested estate actions, fraudulent deed transfers, or family disputes in the period following a spouse's death, the period when vulnerability is highest and predation is most common. The fund provided emergency housing assistance and full legal representation through Raymond Osei's office for qualifying applicants. The first recipient was a woman named Carol Burney, 71 years old, of Millbrook Road in Denton Falls, whose stepson had filed a fraudulent deed transfer on the house she had shared with her husband for 28 years during his final hospitalization, telling her that her name had never been on the deed, and that she had no legal standing and had 60 days to vacate. Carol Burney had legal standing. She had been on the deed since 1994. Raymond Osei represented her through the Sycamore Lane Fund, and the fraudulent transfer was reversed, and the stepson faced a separate filing for deed fraud, and Carol Burney did not have to leave her house. When it was over, she called Dora from her kitchen, from the house she had not had to leave, and she said, "I want to know how you knew to stay, how you knew not to just take what they were offering and go." Dora thought about a porch step on a Tuesday afternoon in September. She thought about a curtain moving in a window and a door that did not open. She thought about a woman at an iron fence saying, "You come over here when you're ready," she said. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for a long time, and when it mattered, she was there. I've thought about Howard Greer a great deal since Dora's letter arrived. A man who drove away from the house he built and the life he loved and left behind something precious. Not hidden, exactly, but waiting. Waiting for someone who would understand that some things are worth protecting, not because of what they cost, but because of what they meant to the person who made them. He trusted a neighbor's judgment. The neighbor trusted the street. The street delivered Dora. Love works that way sometimes, in the long way around. Every letter I receive reminds me of the same thing. The people the world gives up on are often the ones who were worth the most all along. If someone has ever tried to make you feel like you have nothing left, leave me a comment. I want to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, stay with this channel. There are more letters. There always are.